101. Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty for real now. It's official. FFT Dynasty, it has its own audio home. And if you are watching on YouTube, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe and follow the new feed, which you can find the link for in the episode description or by searching Fantasy Football Today Dynasty on your favorite podcast platform. And if you like the content we've been putting out, a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify would help us get off to a great start. Thank you for all you that are already watching. Thank you for all who have already gone out and reviewed. The response has been fantastic so far, and now we're actually going to have an episode in the feed. Can't see what happens now. This first episode is going to be special. We're going to talk about running backs, just like literally everyone else on Twitter right now, except we're not going to talk about running back contracts. We're going to talk about running back advanced data, which might be part of the reason for the running back contracts debate. But we'll get into that in just a minute. Dan Schneier is joining me. Dan, welcome back.
I'm happy to be here, and I was really excited today, Heath, when I went out to tweet about this podcast because I'm super excited to do my first podcast with Graham. I've obviously followed his work now for a long time. In my opinion, one of the best analysts in the business. And when I tweeted it out, I was like able to include the link to the actual Dynasty page on iTunes, and I got to see the logo and everything for the first time. I was like, this is official. This is real now. And I do want to say thank you to everyone who has already written a review and sent that in. It is incredibly important for you guys, if you do enjoy the show, to leave us a 5-star rating and review because it'll help us move up in index in iTunes and Spotify, and that's what we need to keep the show going. So I was excited about that.
That was a semi-intro. I'm going to give him a real intro now. Graham Barfield will be joining us. There's no one better if you want to talk about advanced stats than this man. Tell us what's going on at Fantasy Points, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me on. Really excited to talk with you guys today. Excited to talk about some running backs. Definitely excited to not talk too much about these contracts. Oh my gosh, Dan, especially you. I can't imagine how much you're sick of talking about Saquon here. But yeah, a lot of fun stuff going on at fantasypoints.com. We actually just launched our new data side of the product. We have been fast at work for the last 2 years, basically charting every NFL game. Brett Whitefield and Chris Wecht, those are the two guys that are basically running our analytics department, if you will. They've hired a charting team in the last 2 years. We've charted every NFL game, and we just turned in our consumer forward-facing product yesterday. Guys, this is like the coolest fantasy football tools you'll ever see. And pretty much all the running back stats, at least we'll talk about today, will be coming from Fantasy Points data. So I'm really excited about it.
I did check that out yesterday. It is awesome. Really enjoyed. And I'm hoping you can kind of help because I've acclimated pretty quickly to advanced passing stats, to advanced receiving stats. The rushing stats, I still have some more questions about. So that's why I'm glad that you're here to kind of help give us some context for these things. I do want to say that the one good thing about this running back contract debate is I made the mistake yesterday of tweeting something about how I'd rather have a team with Carson Wentz or Gardner Minshew and Saquon Barkley than a team with Daniel Jones and Matt Breida. And I found Dan's burner. And this guy just will not let me go. So hopefully he's listening today. But yeah, very upset with me for that take. We always start the show with 3 questions for our guest. Graham, and I'm going to start with one that makes a lot of sense in the context of this show today. What is your favorite advanced stat for running backs?
So the best stat, I think, for just overall efficiency and just measuring kind of regression and skill is missed tackles forced per attempt. And that's missed tackles forced per carry. We've got, dating back to even the PFF and SIS days, it's probably one of the best statistics that we have that measures running back, just efficiency. It's also pretty sticky year over year. So when I say sticky, that just means that the same running backs that typically are pretty good in missed tackles forced per attempt, like the Nick Chubbs of the world, the Saquon Barkleys of the world, those guys typically rank pretty highly year over year. And we, especially now that we have these running backs that are, that epic 2017 class, all those guys are starting to age out, 27, 28, 29. And we're starting to see their skills regress through missed tackles forced. So if there's one, it's probably that one. I do want to preface this entire conversation by saying, like, there is literally no one good running back efficiency stat. Like, they're all okay-ish, but most of them are really noisy. And I think that's kind of like a pretty good starting point for overarching, conversation that like really there's not one great advanced running back stat.
Well, I do appreciate that because I think there's been a lot, and we've seen like the charts are particularly awesome, Dan, that we've seen a lot more on Twitter over the last year or two. But usually they get used and weaponized to say, see, this guy stinks, or see, this guy is better than this guy. And I don't know, like, I think the way we should say it is this particular metric, which measures this, says this guy is better at that thing than this guy, right, Dan?
Yeah, that's a better way to do it. It's also, I mean, it's interesting too, because I think some of these advanced metrics, like, for example, I'm going to ask you about a player at some point today, Graham, who I've talked about a bunch on FFT over the last month, Travis Etienne, who has, dating back to Clemson days, was really strong in forced missed tackles metrics, and that is carried over the NFL. But when I watch him on tape, I feel like his vision is not there. I feel like he's missing holes. I feel like he's bouncing to the outside on plays where he shouldn't be. And ultimately, I don't know if he's maximizing the yards on each attempt. So I wonder, like, how you can mix in some of those metrics and how you can kind of value them versus just kind of what your eyes tell you as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking of ways to quantify vision for a long time at running back, right? Like that's kind of part of the reason I came up with yards created. And by the way, I have never once said yards created is perfect. It is a completely flawed stat, just like all running back stats. It's very, very subjective, just like all running back stats. But that being said, you're right. I mean, Etienne is probably he's one of the best litmus tests right now for running back efficiency stats, because if you look at something like rush yards over expectation, which is next gen stats number, he's very good. You look at explosive carries. I mean, Etienne's obviously a great speedster, but you're right. Yeah. I think, just watching, I'm a huge Jags fan, so there's that. I watched every Jags game last year, and you're right. He left a lot of yards on the field. But that being said, there's this kind of like new age of running backs. Like he's definitely in this bucket for me, along with Ken Walker. Mm-hmm. And I'm calling them like true 3 outcome runners. You guys are baseball fans. We've all heard of true 3 outcomes for baseball. I think there's like true 3 outcome running backs in the NFL. And Etienne is like, he's one of them. You either get a home run, you get the 10+ yard explosive carry, you get the play where he's either striking out, he made the wrong read, poor vision, or you get a walk. It's like a 3 or 4 yard carry. I think those guys are really starting to kind of come into the NFL and come in vogue. And by the way, advanced analytics are probably not going to like a lot of those backs because there's so many negative carries. Ken Walker last year, like 70% of his carries went for 5 or fewer yards. But when he did go for 5 or more yards, he hit big. So I just think this whole discussion is so context driven. It's so, this is kind of a cop out, but it really is context driven, and it's so dependent on offense. Let's just stick with the Jags. I thought Doug Peterson did a fantastic job scheming up Etienne correctly.
Yes.
Using him off tackle, understanding if he's going to run inside, it's got to be a light box, out of shotgun. He did a fantastic job of doing that. So we need to kind of push this conversation forward. One thing that we're going to be trying to do at Fantasy Points Data is just that. It's like trying to provide more context and team-driven context around running backs. And I think that's really where this conversation needs to be headed, is like, how do we put a curve on usage and team-related context like blocking and usage?
So question number 2, and like we hit on like 6 of the things that I want to talk about later. So if you feel like we just kind of pulled one of the strings, we didn't go all the way there, like all those things, yards before contact, yards after contact. Jacob Gibbs, who kind of put this episode together, this is a quasi beyond the box score episode, really had some interesting theories that I want to bounce off you about those numbers, specifically the forced missed tackles. But let's get to question number 2. Who is one running back dynasty managers should be buying based on advanced stats?
Buying. One guy I've always loved is Aaron Jones. And I know, he's 28 years old now. He's an aging running back. I just did a dynasty startup draft. I got him in the 9th round. Yep. If I can plug him in as my RB2 right now, Aaron Jones has, by the way, shown no skill regression. Still at the top in terms of missed tackles forced, still at the top in yards after contact, which he's always been. He's always been nothing but a top 10 runner in most efficiency metrics. Right now, if you're a contending team or a team that just really needs an RB2 for dynasty, I'd be buying Aaron Jones on the low.
I love to hear that because I literally sent a trade offer for Aaron Jones yesterday. So go ahead and accept that right now. Dan, you're a little bit more excited about A.J. Dillon this year, right?
I wouldn't say I'm more excited about A.J. Dillon. It's more that I'm just a little bit more down on Aaron Jones in redraft. In Dynasty, I don't dislike the idea of buying incredibly low because of what Graham said. There really hasn't been a skills drop off. It's not like I'm selling him because of the skills. I'm selling him because of the situation for redraft more so.
Yeah. I mean, we got for Dynasty, man, we got to keep in mind all these running backs we're going to talk about today. We got to keep in mind that like most of them are 1 to 2 year windows. And Aaron Jones is at the end of his 1 to 2 year window here.
I think that caveat that you gave about if you are a contender should just apply across the board to running backs. Like like you look at the guys, like we had DeAndre Swift and Javonte Williams in everybody's Dynasty top 5 a year ago because they were young and had so like all this upside. And now, maybe they both still do. Okay, question number 3. Is there one running back Dynasty manager should be selling based on the advanced stats?
Yeah, it's Joe Mixon. Mixon has been one guy I've always been high on. Yards created, absolutely loved him coming out of college. All of his efficiency numbers popped. And when he came out in the NFL, all of it popped again. Like he was top of the leaderboards in missed tackles forced per attempt. This past year, it completely fell off a cliff, though. Behind the best offensive line he's had, behind obviously the best quarterback play he's had, he had his worst year ever. Like, by far, he was dead last in missed tackles forced per attempt last year. Again, missed tackles forced per carry, worse than Leonard Fournette. Yards after contact went down the tubes. All of his efficiency metrics were really poor. The thing, we were talking about 3 outcome runners. Mixon had like 70% of his carries go for 5 or fewer yards, but he basically had no explosive runs, like very, very little gains of 10, 15 more yards. I think, Mixon got the restructured contract. Good for him. He still got the touchdown upside with this Bengals offense. But, man, there was a real skill decline last year. And to my knowledge, he wasn't really dealing with any injuries. He was perfectly healthy. So Mixon is one guy I'm kind of putting red flags on right now.
I think it's really interesting. And it kind of gets into one of the questions I want to talk about later is what do we do when what the team is doing doesn't necessarily line up with what the data tells us? And that happens a lot at this position specifically. They let Samaje Perine walk. So now we've got, if we buy into that, and I think if there was a big drop, I had an argument yesterday on Fantasy Football Today with Adam Azer about if Joe Mixon was ever good. I think he was, but maybe if there was a big drop last year, then you got to decide, do you want to bet on Travion Williams? Do you want to bet on Chase Brown? Like who do you want to bet on that backfield? Because there's a half dozen running backs available to them right now, and they seem to be content going in with what they have.
Yeah, that's the thing. We've got to marry up this context of advanced analytics with how the team views the player. And you're right. I mean, their offensive coordinator, I believe, came out this offseason and said, he's still our bell cow. We're still planning as if Mixon will be the bell cow. I'm going into that assumption, into the season with that assumption as well. I think he still can score 8, 9, 10 touchdowns in this offense. But that being said, I mean, we got to be concerned that Mixon's not going to be, a 4.2, 4.5 yards per carry runner anymore. He might be a sub 4.0 runner, and that matters. That efficiency matters.
So we do have a couple of things on the news and notes, a little more than normal, some things we actually have to talk about from a Dynasty perspective. DeAndre Hopkins reportedly headed to the Titans. I don't think we've got any sort of details or official confirmation on that. But this obviously, I was a big Treylon Burks guy a month ago. I'm still pretty much long-term a big Treylon Burks guy, but we need to have a discussion, Dan, about what this does for Hopkins' dynasty value and for Burks' dynasty value. I was pretty encouraged when I look back at last year and remembered that 60% of DeAndre Hopkins' targets last year came from not Kyler Murray. The 4 games he played with Kyler Murray, he was DeAndre Hopkins, 21 fantasy points per game. How do you feel about these two in dynasty, Dan?
It's an interesting spot for me because coming out of college, I did the eval for us on Burks, and he got a really high grade for me. I thought his film was really good, and I figured there's a way to use him at the NFL that could be even better than how they used him in college. But now I'm in a holding period because on the surface, it feels like this is a good time to buy Treylon Burks in Dynasty because of obviously some people trying to ship him off because of DeAndre Hopkins. But in my head, it's not necessarily the best time to buy him because I know what's going to happen in Tennessee. We're going to get through a year of Tannehill. They're probably going to be competitive. And then we're going to turn to this Will Levis experiment. I just have zero faith that Will Levis can be an NFL quarterback, and I just can't get it out of my mind. I've seen too much Levis, and I just don't see it in my head. I don't see the direction. So I know I'm going to be dealing with a year or two of Levis and Burks. And by that point, I can then buy Burks for an even cheaper price. So if I'm looking to buy him, I'm almost waiting for the disaster that I foresee coming with Levis. This is just me personally. And then I'm buying him at the absolute lowest point. As for now with Dynasty, you're looking at a situation where they're not going to throw the football very much. We know that. There's still the same offense in place. They're going to probably funnel most of the targets through Hopkins. So you're looking at redraft. Burks not on my radar anymore, unfortunately, and I love him as a player. And then in Dynasty, I'm probably waiting to buy low into a different point.
Graham, you mentioned Aaron Jones as a buy low for a contender. Do you feel the same way about DeAndre Hopkins? You still think he can help a team win a championship this year?
I'm on the fence for Hopkins right now. I still want to dive in a little bit more. I actually just wrote an article that's up on the site, fantasypoints.com, just reviewing the move. There's some concerning red flags around Hopkins' profile. Like, he really struggled against man coverage last year, and he really didn't get that bad of quarterback play. Like you said, his quarterback play was definitely better from Kyler Murray. He was really good against zone, though. Like, and that to me is what his role is in this offense. He's a chain mover against zone. He can get open, still make contested catches in the end zone, get open in the end zone. So for me, I still think he's a solid fantasy wide receiver 3. But I think his days of having like a ceiling around wide receiver 1 are over.
Dan, former Giant Evan Engram signed a 3-year deal. This gives us a little bit more security about his long-term future. How do you feel about Engram as a dynasty tight end? Is he a low-end number 1? Is he a high-end number 2? Do you use this opportunity to sell because now he seems a little bit safer and Evan Ingram's never actually safe?
No, I actually do like Evan Engram in Dynasty. I feel like Evan Engram, he has this billing of this injury-prone, not safe guy because of early in his career. He got very unlucky with injuries, but he's played all of his games in the last 2 seasons. His last one with the Giants and this one with Jacksonville. And I like buying into him now because I'm pairing him with Trevor Lawrence, a quarterback who I have a lot of expectations for moving forward. And I know I'm getting him for at least 3 years with Lawrence. So this year in redraft, I'm not as excited about Engram. But as that team kind of shakes out over the years, we're going to have that Zay Jones contract come off the books at some point. Who knows if that Christian Kirk contract will see it through its entirety. So I think he becomes a bigger role as he goes through these 3 years and continues to build that rapport with Lawrence.
Graham, you gave us your feelings on Joe Mixon, so we'll skip that news item. But no deal for Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard at the deadline. I kind of have 2 questions here. The first one is about Saquon and Jacobs. I don't really feel any actual concern that they're going to miss games. So first off, do you agree with that? And then second, all 3 of these backs now only guaranteed 1 year. Pollard and Saquon at 26, Jacobs at 25. How much of a long-term concern is it to you that they could suffer an ACL injury in November or December and not be a starting running back going into next year?
Yeah, there's that concern with everybody. It was interesting to see how all this played out yesterday. Obviously, Pollard was like, yeah, I knew I wasn't going to get a long-term deal. He's like, yeah, I'm going to take the franchise tag. Barkley's been, he's been barking up a tree about this for months now. And then Jacobs was like, I was literally sitting in the parking lot ready to sign if it went through. To me, I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Barkley's probably the highest odds to sit out of this group. Pollard's not. I'd be stunned if Jacobs did. All of that being said, I think we see all these guys on week 1. Obviously, Pollard will be fine.
Yeah, there seems to be no scenario in my head that any of these guys can afford to sit out. Obviously, It's only like 640,000, I think, you lose per game check for each game missed. That may not be as important to these players, but long term, to miss a season, it's not. It's a sad situation at running back, but it's like these are depreciating assets, and that's how they're viewed right now by the league. So you take a year off, you're now 28 going into free agency. Yeah, you have quote unquote less wear and tear, but you're also a year older.
Yeah, I do think it makes a little bit of sense that Pollard reacted the way he did and Barkley and Jacobs reacted
because he's injured, right? Yeah.
Well, he's coming off of an injury, and he's never he had 6 weeks as a quasi starting running back.
And he's also younger in terms of odometer. Like Barkley has way more touches than Pollard. Pollard's, like you just said, Pollard's never really been a featured back. He's still, in my mind, Pollard is like, this is his year to prove it, and he got the tag. He's going to prove it.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you guys, how, and we'll just real quick, we don't need any analysis on this. How would you rank these 3 running backs in Dynasty?
That's a tough one.
I've got it Jacobs, Barkley, Pollard.
Yeah.
I think I'm still going to go Barkley first out of those. Barkley, Jacobs, Pollard for me.
And really the only difference is that Barkley's a year younger than these guys.
Yeah, I have it Barkley, Jacobs, Pollard too. But I mean, I've been a fan of all 3 of these players for the last 4 years. So
It's going to be very interesting because we've talked about that contract year being a motivational thing for running backs in the past. I wonder if some of that starts to disappear a little bit if the big contract's not there at the end of the contract year ever.
Right.
It will.
They still have to keep a job, but besides that, the motivation's
it will.
not
I
as
mean,
much. Yeah.
You know, Zeke and Lev Bell and Melvin Gordon too. I mean, they just kind of ruined the whole idea of a second contract for running back. I mean, it is what it is. Todd Gurley, especially. I mean, I think Gurley was really the death knell, but it was the first Zeke contract that was it.
Gurley, I don't think played a single down on that contract because he got the injury and then he came back and they cut him.
Yep. Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, so that's my biggest question is like going forward. It's like, okay, we can't change the rookie wage scale until the next CBA. Like
10 years.
It doesn't change exactly. It doesn't change the fact that second year, not second year, but second contract running backs are still like, I mean, they're a complete market inefficiency. So like, I don't see that changing.
If you can do what Seattle did and draft Charbonnet and Walker in back-to-back drafts and get them on your cap for $2 million or less for 4 years of team control, it's just hard to imagine that's a worse scenario than paying $15 million for one guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially I think their skills match each other pretty well.
Yeah. And relating it back to this free agency spend, like Miles Sanders is the only guy who got like a 4-year deal. But you look at David Montgomery's contract, like he got 3 years, $15 million. Like that's actually not that bad of a deal in the grand scheme of the market. So, it's interesting to see the NFL kind of tab like Jamal Williams, David Montgomery as the guys, that were primed for roles. They still got like relative to the market, like pretty good deals. So I think that's the thing is like any future free agent running back deals will be these 3-year, 2-year deals worth, 10, 12, 15 mil.
And we know that David Montgomery and Jamal Williams are the darlings of advanced running back stats. More on that after this short break. Okay, Graham. So what I wanted to do is kind of just run through I have some questions about a few of the stats. If some players come up, especially from Dan, we can take it that direction as well. But I want to start with a question from Jacob Gibbs, and it's yards before contact. I think a lot of people see that and they think that's an offensive line stat. Dan was talking, you guys were talking about earlier, a way of potentially measuring vision. Jacob was suggesting yards before contact, especially compared to the rest of their teammates, might be a way to do that. Do you feel like yards before contact is entirely an offensive line stat, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. Just like when I was doing yards created, yards blocked was a little bit too. There's running backs set up their blocks. And, a lot of times this is that context that I don't think a lot of advanced analytics can capture just yet. We're working to get there, but it's the idea of setting up blocks. We'll go back to the ETN example. Like, think of it just watching football, right? Like ETN is faster than most linebackers. He's going to be faster than most corners. He's hitting angles and getting to places on the field with his speed that most players can't get to. And that is all coming before contact. Those are before contact yards most of the time. By the way, I don't really have a great answer for this. I think looking at it on the team level is great. Like looking at yards before contact, ETNs versus let's say this year Tank Bigsby's. I think that'd be kind of interesting. But at the same time, we're dealing with sample size issues. ETN might have 220 carries. Bigsby might have like 60 this year.
There's also the issue that I wanted to get. I don't want to cut you off, but it's like this is the most important thing I wanted to talk about with you.
Sure.
Trying to figure out yards before contact, trying to figure out the value of scheme when it comes to evaluating running backs and not just the blocking scheme, but individual plays. So it's like you talked about, like we can evaluate Bigsby versus ATM, but what if like the plays the Jaguars are calling for ETN are different than they're calling for Bigsby? Because you mentioned it last year. There were a lot of good run designs from Doug Peterson last year that got blockers in space, that pinned down receivers and had ETN just like in a pin pull concept, getting out to the outside and having tons of ground in front of him.
Yeah.
But like if Bigsby is just getting inside zone the whole time, it's like it's a very different situation.
That's the thing. That's the biggest thing is like we've got to. I think if anything, this whole conversation hopefully will push the conversation forward of just really trying to focus more on usage first. Like see how that how that back is used first. So like we can take this another way too. Like I was having this conversation with Brett Whitefield the other day, and we we're talking about Khalil Herbert. Khalil Herbert had fantastic yards after contact numbers last year. It was just extremely explosive, but he had very, very few short yardage runs. So he had like very few 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, 4th and 1, 4th and 2. And those types, like just not being used in short yardage down and distance, you're just used on 1st and 10, 2nd and 5, whatever, 2nd and 7, as opposed to short yardage. Like you're getting totally different play calls. You're getting different box looks.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I mean, it's not just scheme. It's also down and distance. It's a lot of different things. And that's the trickiest part of all of this. I'm doing these, I'm looking at the last 2 years of fantasy points data and trying to find ways that our numbers correlate to fantasy points, right? And I've been digging into all the efficiency metrics, and like at the best, like the best correlation to fantasy points is 0.2. Like it's just, it's a mixed bag, man.
Right.
Like there's so much context that goes into a successful run play, and it's. I think our brains have been broken by fantasy in the sense that like we see Patrick Mahomes hit Travis Kelce, it's a 1-to-1 thing. We know what just happened on the play, but on a running back play, there's like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different things that can go into making that play successful. And there's really not a great way to quantify a lot of it. We can do better things like yards before contact, especially like Jacob was mentioning at the team level. But it's still, like you said, we're still looking at these things through keyholes. We're still looking at these things at different schemes and different plays. I think with our data, we have in our dashboards, you can look at all man blocking concepts and all zone blocking concepts. You can see how many carries we have charted on man and zone blocking, and that will give you a lot more context than what we typically see. But all of that being said, it's still not perfect. You're still going to have examples where, Khalil Herbert averages 6.5 yards per carry and David Montgomery's at 4.2, and everybody thinks Montgomery stinks, but it's like, no, Montgomery just got all the short yardage carries.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's the other thing, and you mentioned sample size in that answer, and especially when it's somebody like Khalil Herbert or a backup running back who might have 100 carries, that yards before contact per rush attempt is going to be much more heavily impacted by one play.
Right.
That's kind of a breakdown by the defense, and you got a 50-yard carry. Well, all of a sudden the stats are kind of out of whack because the sample size is so small.
Yep. I mean, it's so easy to just look at, okay, Justin Jefferson ran 650 routes. He got 180 targets. Like, this is just so easy to analyze. And then with running backs, it's like, I know who the workhorse backs are going to be. Like Derrick Henry stays healthy, he's going to get 300 carries, well over 300 carries this year. But then after that, it's like, everything is by committee now, by and large. And then you're looking at even smaller and smaller things like, we were talking about Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon are used completely differently in the context of that offense. So that's really the biggest thing is like if we can find ways to better contextualize within the offense, that's probably the next step for running backs.
I'm going to start with you on this one, Dan, and then Graham, you can kind of follow up. But you mentioned explosive run rate earlier. Those guys like ETN, like Ken Walker, I would say like DeAndre Swift. We love those guys in fantasy. Like that's one of the stats that we got big playability. This is a really good running back. Those guys also seem to lose important touches to backs that we don't think are very good, like Jamal Williams or David Montgomery, and I think David Montgomery is good, but like those kind of guys. So Dan, do you think that it's possible that we care more about explosive run rate than coaches do? And whereas they value the guy who's going to get what's blocked?
Sometimes like
is it the coach, maybe an individual coach thing too?
Yeah, I think it may be an individual coach thing. Like I watched a lot of Swift last year, early in the year, like when he came back from the injury. I don't remember what point it was for beyond the box score. And I could see why the Lions weren't playing him a lot. Like there were issues with the mental processing, and he was not, there were some holes that were just inexplicable that he was just not processing and understanding and setting up, like Graham was talking about before with his blocks and going through. But, and so you see him come off the field, but in other situations, like for example, like Kamara, he has such a unique role in that. He had at least such a unique role in that offense that it never really made sense for him to be that workhorse in every spot. I think what we're finding is a lot of different coaches are looking for different situations and downs and distances to use different running backs to fit their skill set. They're not just, it's not one guy fits all anymore. So I think it's more so that, but as far as explosive plays goes though, I think it's almost going to go in the other direction. Like teams are going to look and prioritize getting these guys who can deliver them explosive plays. That's how you win games.
Graham, we had a good comment here from Guitar Ninja Rick. says ETN probably isn't getting any touches near the goal line this year. He didn't hardly get any touches near the goal line last year, which is kind of like those two things do kind of go in hand, right? Like less short yardage opportunities for the guys who make big plays because they're less likely to get 1 yard when you need it.
Yeah, and Etienne was not a very good short yardage runner last year, and I don't think he was a very good short yardage runner at Clemson. He did get 45% of the Jags inside 5 carries last season, but I think that's probably the biggest concern with Etienne this year for fantasy is actually that loss of inside 5 touches, because I mean Etienne was not that high volume of a pass catching back, so any touchdown loss for Etienne would be pretty harmful for his fantasy stock.
Do you think that's a concern at all with Walker, with them bringing in a bigger back like Charbonnet?
It is. Yeah, that's my big concern with Walker too. Walker was one of my favorite running backs coming out last year. Rashad Penny, when he's healthy, is one of the best running backs in the world. But yeah, man, I think Walker got literally 100% of the inside 5 carries last year. If Charbonnet gets 40% of those, it definitely hurts Walker for sure.
I just want to do a quick offshoot off of that, because with regards to the Walker situation, and I want to get your take in general on blocking scheme and how it impacts running backs, and then in our case, fantasy. So in Walker's example, and this is the same thing for Dalvin Cook last year. Dalvin Cook plays his entire career in a Kubiak system. It's perfect for him. His vision is amazing in it. He looks awesome. Last year, they bring in a new offensive coordinator there. They changed the blocking scheme. And in my opinion, Cook just did not look the same. And for Walker, it's like you talked about how much you liked him coming out. I did too, but I thought they were going to, I liked him sometimes when he was running at Michigan State with power gap concepts and pin pull stuff that he was just taking advantage of his athleticism on. Last year, Seattle basically just ran zone the entire time. I think I talked to someone who covered the Vikings before the Giants playoff game. They're like, I don't think I've seen a single play with a pulling guard this entire season. And I feel like Seattle was in that same bucket of just running zone. And for a player like Walker, how do you let that impact your opinion of the player? And how much do you look at stuff like scheme?
Yeah, so they did run quite a bit of zone for Walker last year. But in our charting, we had Walker with 150 carries on a man blocking scheme. And to your point, he averaged 5.1 yards per carry on his man blocking scheme carries versus 3.6 yards per carry on zone. And yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, Walker is, I still think he is their clear early down guy. Like Ken Walker's, to me, what like Joe Mixon was coming out of college. Like he is an extremely creative, extremely instinctive runner. You're going to have the strikeouts. Like you're going to have to live with when he gets stuffed behind the line of scrimmage and misses the hole. But like when he hits big, and especially on these man schemes, like his success rate against man was much higher than zone 2. So I think Seattle, especially at the end of the year, used him better. I think early in the year when it was him and Penny, they were just trying to find ways to kind of get him in a change of pace role. But by the end of the year, especially in the last couple of games, they were starting to really dominate on these man blocking schemes. And that's where Walker will show his colors. Because to your point, he's not a zone runner. He's not, same with Saquon Barkley. I've always said Saquon Barkley is a much better man runner than zone.
Saquon Barkley had his best year last year when the Giants finally went away from a lot of zone and they brought in a ton of power gap.
Look at that. Yep. It was all, dude, him on power was
amazing.
Unstoppable at Penn State. And it was unstoppable last year.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's enough Saquon Barkley. Let's move to the David Montgomery stat. Avoid rate, missed tackles forced, broken tackles. Like there's like 7 of these stats now seeming to measure the same thing. You gave your favorite at the top of the show. Talk about kind of why that is and how it's maybe different from some of the others.
So we'll back up a little bit. Missed tackles forced is basically the best all-encapsulating number because it captures, you're not just like breaking tackles, not just like running through defenders like Derrick Henry does or stiff arming a defender like Derrick Henry does. It also includes elusiveness. Now that is the true now we're talking about like that's pretty subjective.
Right.
That's why SIS sticks to broken tackles because it's way less subjective. It's clear when Derrick Henry runs through a defender or stiff arms a defender. It's a little less clear in terms of elusiveness. So I chart when I do yards created, I chart missed tackles forced by speed, elusiveness, and power. At Fantasy Points Data, we kind of do something similar. It's just all missed tackles forced. We try to do our best with elusiveness. I'm actually not familiar with avoid rate. but I know broken tackles is from SIS, and I know
Yeah.
they just chart it through like, stiff arms or, just trucking a defender.
Now, some of these guys that we see that force a lot of broken tackles, don't necessarily do a lot after they break the tackle. Some people turn it into it. And so that's where another question from Gibbs, like, is there some way that we can blend this missed tackles forced with yards after contact to form a better stat?
Yeah, so I think this is where usage comes in, and you might have mentioned it with David Montgomery. David Montgomery was awesome last year, especially in terms of missed tackles forced per attempt. He led all running backs, forcing 0.31 missed tackles forced per attempt. That was better than Nick Chubb, better than Ramondre Stevenson. But I think I mentioned it, like, he got all the short yardage stuff. So like his yards after contact, his yards per carry numbers, they all plummeted because he was on the field so much on third and twos, fourth and twos, whatever, in the red zone at the goal line. So I think one of the best ways to look at this would be to back out all short yardage carries and just show basically what happened on early downs. And that's I'm going to tease an article that's coming out here soon that I've been working on with some of our data. Again, 2 years of sample, so we got a pretty decent sample size to work with. But yeah, I think kind of looking at this from like a down and distance perspective first, and then just trying to like contextualize and normalize from there would probably be the best way to go about it.
And I do think, Dan, that sometimes the fact that David Montgomery had to force 3 missed tackles before he got to the line of scrimmage helped him in that category. I have a theory that this year he is going to probably have a career year and also rank lower than he has in the past in missed tackles forced.
Interesting. What makes you think he'll rank lower in the missed tackles forced, just that they're blocking it so much better?
Because I don't think that he will have as many tackles to avoid.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Bears have been the worst run blocking offensive line for the last couple of years, and like Lions are
the best,
easily top 5.
Yeah.
Easily,
they might be. I think this year they'll be the best with Sewell.
They probably will be.
Yeah,
they probably will be.
I love Montgomery too, by the way, Heath. I think we're gonna have to battle for him in a ton of these mocks coming up, and I'm not excited about that.
I mean, and I don't think like that. I don't think you have to be down on Gibbs at all to love Montgomery. This offense will sustain 2 top 20 running backs, or definitely 2 top 24 running backs.
100% agree with that.
So I've got no problem there. I mean, this is kind of a new one here. Expected fantasy points you've got there. Kind of explain to people where that comes from.
Sure. So expected fantasy points is Scott Barrett's brainchild. It's basically taking what happens on a play and saying, hey, this is what this play was worth in terms of expected points for the receiver, for the quarterback, and if it's a running play, for the running back. We look at down and distance, like I was saying earlier. So, down and distance is a huge thing. For receivers, we're looking at air yards. So how far downfield the pass was thrown. If it was thrown in the end zone, that's obviously worth a touchdown if it's caught. So we're looking at that. For running backs, again, down distance, we're looking at, every carry as you get closer and closer to the goal line is worth more fantasy points in terms of your touchdown equity. So expected fantasy points is basically like the catch-all metric for seeing what a play was really worth. And then we compare it to actually what happened. So like, last year, Kyle Pitts and Deontay Johnson, we would just want to go with some receivers,
right,
were probably the 2 biggest regression candidates year over year. Like they got massively unlucky according to XFP. Deontay Johnson should have scored like 5 more fantasy points per game. Kyle Pitts, it was like 4.5 more fantasy points per game. And they just, either because of quarterback play, Johnson just didn't score any touchdowns. But Kyle Pitts had like one of the lowest catchable target rates among all tight ends. So it's a XFP and expected fantasy points at Fantasy Points data is probably one of the best ways to find, regression candidates and guys who overperformed. We can take it that way too.
Dan, I think like I was just looking at this when I was writing breakouts, and I finally, for the first year in Kyle Pitts' career in redraft, get to call him a breakout and not a bust because we're not drafting him in the 3rd round.
I love it.
But one of the things I noticed was we talk all the time about how bad Zach Wilson was and how Garrett Wilson without Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson was the only quarterback that had fewer on-target throws last year than Marcus Mariota in terms of a percentage. Mariota was absolutely terrible. Pitts didn't get to play with Ritter. And so like with Pitts' athleticism, with all those things, like it's easy for me to say, okay, that's a regression opportunity.
But don't forget that in the small, I know, albeit it was a small sample size, but Ritter was not too much better than that. Ritter was
not
as a rookie.
Almost
He was
as bad as Mariota.
He was 5 to 10% better by most of the metrics that I looked at as a rookie. And pretty much all things I expect, even bad rookies, will be. Now, Davis Mills was not all are, but I expect at least some level of improvement from a rookie.
Better chance to get a level of improvement from rookie, I think, in this case, because there's a smaller sample size. I think if you put the 8 games on tape like Mills did, then there's a much better chance of a regression. That's at least what NFL defensive coordinators will tell you. They'll say we need 8 games on a rookie, and then that's where. And you saw it with Jones. It's like every quarterback ever that doesn't work out. And I don't want to say Jones yet. We don't know, but like in other quarterback situations that haven't worked out, like it might maybe help him that he hasn't played a lot, Ritter. But I am not very confident in Ritter. And that it kills me because I love Drake London as a talent. I love Pitts as a talent, and I can't find myself buying into either right now because of Ritter.
Well, that's the question I want to ask you, Graham, and it doesn't have to be player specific. It can be situation or player, because Johnson and Pitts' situation Pitts has slightly changed. Johnson's really hasn't.
Yeah.
In what instances do you say, well, this guy underperformed because he was unfortunate, or he underperformed because his quarterback's terrible, or he underperformed because he's just a player who's going to, like, I assume there are certain players who are do worse than their expected fantasy points on a regular basis.
Yeah, and then those players typically lose their roles. That's what we find. Right. That's the greatest thing about XFPs. We can capture regression, and then you're like, oh, that guy completely lost his role. Let's relate it back to Kyle Pitts and Desmond Ritter for a second. Like, I think the biggest thing with Ritter this year, and I think the biggest case for the Falcons you can make, is watching those 4 games that Ritter started last year. That offense was painful outside of Drake London. Like, they had no weapons. They had nothing, absolutely nothing. And the only thing Ritter could do and do well were those program throws to London that were scheduled on time, clear window throws. And to me, if Ritter can hit window throws to Drake London, and he's going to be able to hit window throws to Kyle Pitts. Now they're going to be able to throw in Kyle Pitts in the mix. They're going to be able to move Bijan Robinson out. Cordell Patterson will play in kind of a hybrid role. So if you want to make a bull case argument for Ritter, it's okay, watching the Falcons, Mariota could not hit the window throws. He couldn't. Ritter at least kind of could, especially with Drake London. He had great chemistry, especially in those last couple games with London. If you want to make a bull case argument, that's it. That being said, Jake Tribby, one of our great contributors at Fantasy Points, huge Cincinnati Bearcat fan, was telling me the other day, Ritter's always had accuracy concerns. He's watched every single game of Ritter's. He was missing receivers. This is just going to be who he is. He was missing receivers even in his best year, his last year. So that's the thing with Ritter. He's not going to be Joe Burrow out there, but if he can hit the window throws and hit the on timing scheduled throws, I think the Falcons can be pretty good on offense this year, much, much better than last year.
We have one more running back stat. It's not a running stat, though. It's a receiving stat that I want to ask Graham about, and then we're going to get to a few players as well. Take one more short break. All right, we are back, and before we get to the final stat, I just want to remind everybody, there's a lot of you here who were not here at the beginning of the show. It is official. FFT Dynasty has its own audio home. If you're watching on YouTube, we would really appreciate it if you subscribe and follow the new feed, which you can find the link for in the episode description, or by searching Fantasy Football Today Dynasty on your favorite podcast platform. If you've liked the content we've been putting out, a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify would help us get off to a great start. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, please smash the like button. Thank you very much, Graham. This has been in my head for a while, so I'm hoping that you can get rid of it, because I haven't got an answer that I feel good about yet. Yards per route run versus yards per target. My real understanding of the value of yards per route run over yards per target is that targets are earned. And yards per route run obviously factors in targets per route run. It gives you credit for earning targets. Do you think that's true for running backs, or do you think that running back targets are mostly a product of quarterback or scheme, as opposed to, or designed screenplays, as opposed to a running back earning the targets?
Most of the time, it's going to end up being a check down. I would say, it really depends on the offense. If we want to stick with the example we were talking about earlier with the Jags and ETN, there's just basically no designed running back targets. You'd see a screen here and there to ETN to kind of, throw off a pass rush or throw off, if they're blitzing consistently. But by and large, ETN's pass, receptions last year were all kind of designed plays. Like he very, very rarely got checkdowns. It just depends on the offense. Like Ramondre Stevenson was the checkdown king last year. This year, I don't think there's going to be near as many checkdowns for Ramondre, and they're going to be scheming a lot more to their tight ends and receivers. So again, this is one of those things where it's like, man, it really comes down to scheme. I will say Christian McCaffrey is like the only running back year over year to get a 20% target share. Like if you want to point to one guy, him and Alvin Kamara would be it. Like those are the two guys that every single year, Saquon Barkley too, to a lesser extent, but really Eckler, McCaffrey, and Kamara have been the three guys like consistently up around 15, 18%, 20% target share, where you could say, okay, those targets are earned. But then by and large, I think the rest of the field, it's like, it really comes down to maybe it's earned, and a lot of it is really just checkdowns.
Well, and that's like you mentioned one of the guys I was talking about, and you kind of went both ways with the guy who did not have design plays and the guy who did. But DeAndre Swift, I think, like people look at DeAndre Swift over the last couple of years and say, well, he's really good in the passing game, though. They did design quite a few, especially when Anthony Lynn was there, design a lot of targets to him. Going to a team, the Eagles, that kind of like Jacksonville just does not or has not thrown to their running backs. I feel like the yards per target stat tells us more about what the running back is doing than the yards per route run stat does.
Yeah, well, with running backs, routes run is probably just your bulk. Like, for example, like this is ironic, but we can keep on the ETN example. Like ETN ran a lot of empty calorie routes last year. Like he was on the field a ton, like 70, 80% snap share, but he just was never getting the ball. So it's like, yeah, his yards per route run looks awful, but then you look at his yards per reception, you look at his yards per target, and it's a lot better. So one of the things we do here at Fantasy Points Data is we actually chart designed plays. And this is Brett Whitefield's kind of brainchild of looking at like, okay, where is this play designed to go? Where's the quarterback? What's his first read? If you look at, let's take the Rams offense, for example, like pretty much every first read Stafford is going to make is going to go to Cooper Kupp.
Right.
McVay is just a genius at, scheming up those targets. So we're tracking that. We're finding ways of tracking first reads and design targets. And what I found at the early look of the data is that, running back targets are very rarely designed. And then when they are, it's like, it's the Austin Ecklers, the McCaffreys, Debo is used like a running back in that offense. If you want to lump him in with that, that group too.
Dan, we get the hopeful reports about running backs playing receiver, and rarely does that work out. But it does seem like one of the things is the running backs who actually do that, the running backs who actually get targeted beyond the line of scrimmage, those are the guys where it might be a little bit stickier.
Yeah, for sure. But those guys are so few and far in between. Like that was the point I was going to try to make, because Graham was talking earlier, brought up Barkley as an example. Yeah. I actually think from watching these games on film, like I watched the Giants, it's not a good example, because most of what Barkley caught last year was just flare routes. They were just running quick game with slants flat and curl flat. And then it's just like, if Barkley's in the flat and the quick game in the middle of the field, receiver isn't open, just hit Barkley. But then you have McCaffrey, who's lining up as a boundary receiver. He's in the slot. He's playing position. They're playing positionless football with him. Those are the design touches that I'm looking for as a receiving running back in the pass game. The flare outs, to me, that could go away if the Giants progress their offense. If Jones gets better at just going through the reads, you don't want to throw a flare out to a running back. That's like that's like, okay, let's just throw it out there, because what we thought was going to be there isn't there on our first read. So I just feel like, if you look at, and even in Eckler's case, this is what scares me a little bit about Eckler. It's like, I saw a stat yesterday, he had 151 routes around the line of scrimmage. Eckler, I don't have the exact stat now. I'm missing it. I wrote it up in an article. I can't even remember it, but that was Lombardi's offense. And like, is that going to continue now? I don't know. I doubt it with Kellen Moore.
Well, let's stick with Eckler, because I think this is probably like a good segue into designed plays. Like last year, the Chargers offense was designed to not really throw the ball down the field past the first down markers.
Right.
I don't know why Joe Lombardi did this. I have no idea. Like, it's like, we're still trying to find the guy who's doing this, but it's like, oh my God, just let Herbert freaking chuck it, dude. So like, of course, they don't have reads that go past the first down sticks. You're going to get a lot of check down throws to Eckler. And, just looking through the numbers, like the majority of Eckler's targets last year, over close to 75% were check down plays. He had only 26% of his targets were designed targets. Then you look at the top end, like I was talking about earlier, Travis Etienne, nearly 50% of his targets were designed. Those are your screens. Those are your, like it's clear, they're just trying to roll out, or like a
wheel route.
Like a wheel route, or even like a jet screen where you're trying to get your receivers in a 3-by-1, and you throw to ETN on the back side of the 3-by-1, or on the front side, whatever the case may be. We're trying to track that. But yeah, I mean, by and large, your most running back targets, I'm looking right here, Barkley's at 75% of his targets last year were check down. So by and large, it's check down targets. Very, very rarely running back targets are going to be designed. And the other 75%, it's all just based on, where they're at in the check down, or where their, responsibility is in terms of blocking.
Yep.
So I do have a couple of running backs. We got about 5 minutes left that I wanted to check in with you on. We already talked about a few of these guys. That means we did a good job. I think we talked about half of them, actually. So 2 running backs who have been backups. Pollard had a much bigger role, obviously, last year than Alexander Mattison. We talked about Pollard. You seem pretty optimistic about the advanced stats looking good for him. I've heard mixed things about Alexander Mattison, and I think his situation is one of the ones that has bit fantasy managers more than just about any other at running back over the last few years, is taking that guy who has been strictly a backup, thrusting him into a starter role, and then counting on him for fantasy purposes. How does Mattison look through the lens of advanced stats? And then Dan, give your thoughts on him after that.
Yeah, Mattison is really tricky because, I just got to give a shout out to the whole fantasy community as a whole. Like Madison a couple years ago would have been a 4th round pick. Yeah. Now everybody's like, okay, I'm not so sure about these guys anymore. Maybe I do want to take Chris Godwin over Alexander Mattison. Or maybe I do want to take Deontay Johnson. So I think, I think the market is getting a lot more efficient in that respect. If you look at like team level context, we were talking about earlier, especially with the Vikings, they are all zone, especially, in prior years. That's the big thing, is like that old role where, the old Mike Zimmer offense is gone. Like this is not a run first Vikings offense. If you look across the board, Vikings were top 6 in pass rate when leading. They were top 6 on early downs. They were top 6, in the red zone. Like that role, that high volume role that Cook had for all those years is just gone. So like that's the pretense in terms of projection that I'm looking at with Mattison. Yep. In terms of his advanced analytics, like it's tricky. It's tricky. Like a small sample, his missed tackles forced are very good, but then you look at his team level, like zone yards per carry compared to Dalvin Cook, it's very, very poor. So he's one of those guys where it's really tricky, and I think it's going to come down to whether or not the Vikings add a second running back here, because right now, I mean, his role looks really good. They could certainly add a veteran, but Mattison to me is, I think, appropriately priced as he's got a low end RB1 ceiling, and he's appropriately priced as kind of like one of those sketchy RB2s that, like, you can crane your neck and look at Cam Akers the right way and be like, oh man, he could be an RB1. Do the same thing with Alexander Mattison.
Where are you taking Mattison, Dan?
I actually am a little bit higher on Mattison, but I am, for redraft, because I just have the expectation that I'm going to put the situation first here. And Mattison is the player who they paid here. And behind him right now, at least, and this goes to what Graham said, like if they add someone like Kareem Hunt or Leonard Fournette, my opinion changes entirely. But what they have behind him now is Ty Chandler, whose film I loved, but he was an older prospect that they didn't use much draft capital on. McBride, who I like even more as a fit for that system. He might have been the best zone blocking one cut back in this whole class, and he was amazing at UAB. He has major issues with fumbling, and pass protection is not there. So, like, I don't see how he really gets on the field unless it's for, like, early downs and, like, defined run plays where then you're kind of tipping your hat. So I feel like the only one they can really trust to be on the field and have the Vikings be in a spot where the defenses aren't really guessing run or pass, they can kind of keep it open-ended, is Mattison right now. So because of that, I'm getting a guy in an offense I know is going to continue to hum with a real division of really bad defenses. Well, besides Green Bay, I'm not really high on Detroit or Chicago defensively. So I just feel like there's a good opportunity there for scoring, but it just depends on the role.
Graham, we got a couple of competitions on what might be bad offenses for running backs, but Dameon Pierce and Khalil Herbert, 2 backs that I know Jacob Gibbs has kind of fallen in love with as he's dug into the data just a little bit. Pierce now has to battle Devin Singletary, who they brought in from the Bills. Herbert trying to fight off Deontay Foreman, who in his own regard has some numbers that look pretty good, and Roschon Johnson coming out of Texas. Do you have a strong lean on either one of these backfields? Is there a back amongst this group that you really like?
Yeah, I'm still in on Dameon Pierce, man. I loved him coming out of college. He obviously landed in one of the best spots he could have, like just literally no backfield competition last year besides Rex Burkhead. This year, Devin Singletary has definitely increased competition. I think it comes down to the passing role though. Like Singletary, I think was brought in to be a little more of like a change of pace on early downs, and then especially as a blocker. Dameon Pierce was a really bad blocker at Florida.
Right.
He was really, really bad last year. Like he got pulled from some games because he missed plays. So I don't really care so much about that. Pierce, in terms of yards after contact, missed tackles forced, like blows Singletary out of the water. Like he's clearly the more talented back. So I'm in on Pierce as an RB2. This Bears backfield, man, I have no read on. Like I'll just be straight up honest with you guys. Like I really don't. I liked Roschon Johnson coming out. I thought Deontay Foreman, especially last year, was starting to come off well the Achilles, and then he popped last year for the Panthers. And I was mentioning Herbert earlier. He was a yards after contact and analytical darling last year.
Right.
A lot of that came down to his advantageous usage on early downs. But I guess it's Herbert. That would be my guess, but I feel like 2%, literally like 5% confident in saying that. Like I could also see Roschon Johnson, if we want to go skill set wise, like Johnson is the only guy here I feel confident saying he can play on passing downs. So like if we want to go skill set, we want to make a bull case argument that Johnson is like the only guy who can kind of give, like Dan, you were saying, that versatility of like not knowing if it's run or pass. That matters way less for a team like the Bears, but Roschon's like the only guy in this backfield that can play on passing downs.
I will say it's a good thing Dameon Pierce doesn't play in Chicago. Matty Eberflus saying the number one job of running back is to protect the quarterback. Pierce cannot do that job. Dan, give me your top 3 running backs from these two backfields.
Okay. Oh, from
Houston and Chicago.
Okay. Top 3 overall for fantasy. Number 1 for me is definitely going to be Dameon Pierce. I understand the concerns for sure with him staying on the field, but to me, Pierce with Slowick, the offensive coordinator they're bringing in from San Francisco, it's the literal perfect fit. This outside zone scheme is perfect for his skill set. Yep. So I'm extremely high on Dameon Pierce. I also, like Graham, loved his tape at Florida, and it carried over right away. So he'd be number 1 for me, and Herbert would be number 2 for me. He's another player who I did love coming out of college. I don't want to, say all these players. I just like their college film, but I feel like he's been pretty good in the NFL. What Graham was talking about way earlier on the show, which is creating downfield, creating after contact. So I just feel like I'm getting more upside there. Roschon Johnson was a really good player at Texas. He would have been a much higher draft pick if he didn't play behind Bijan Robinson, but he is still a rookie. So I have some concerns there as far as getting on the field. So I'd probably go 1, 2, and then Roschon 3.
Roschon 3. Is Herbert closer to Roschon or Pierce?
Closer to Roschon for me. Okay. I really like Pierce this year.
I would agree with that. I think Pierce probably a top 20 back, and I'm not sure any of the Bears are be in my top 36 unless one of them gets hurt in training camp or something. Last guy we'll ask you about, Graham. We've been trying to write Derrick Henry off for 2 or 3 seasons now. He's definitely had too many carries. The tires are definitely going to fall off. Is there any sign at all that he's not still King Henry?
So I was writing this up yesterday for my DeAndre Hopkins piece. So yards after contact have definitely dipped. He's gone from 4.2 to 3.2, but that 3.2 is still really freaking good. Like it's still like top 10. Right. He's still right in the mix in terms of missed tackles forced with like Saquon Barkley, Aaron Jones. Like he's not elite. He's never been elite in terms of missed tackles forced. There's been a little skill regression, but like Henry strikes me as an Adrian Peterson type. Like he's going to be 30 next year, and he's still going to look freaking good. Like I maybe, okay, Henry probably doesn't have the same top 5 ceiling that he's had in previous years. We do have to bake in a little skill regression. Their offensive line is also not going to be very good this year. This is easily the worst Titans offensive line that he's had to deal with. But all of that being said, man, I mean, he has been nothing but an outlier for his entire football career. I'm not going to sit here and say like I'm drafting Henry heavily. I have Josh Jacobs ahead of him in my rankings to kind of give you an idea of how I feel about those two. But all that being said, I am definitely not writing off Derrick Henry. I never will. Like literally will never write him off, especially after last year. I mean, he came back from a foot injury and he was back to his normal self, So I think Henry will be just fine in his age 29 season.
Dan, Derrick Henry, round 2/3 pick, always there in round 2, and generally mid to end of round 2. Are you grabbing him there, or you still prefer Jacobs?
It's close for me between those two players. I do typically tend to not go running back though in that spot. I do like some of the receivers more there, especially because this year, like, we didn't get the chance to talk on, but there's a lot of running backs in that rounds 3 through 5 range that I like that I typically don't like in fantasy, like year after year. So it's like a really weird, interesting year there for me.
But it's one of my favorite things is the whole dead zone thing that came to be, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I remember Ben Gretsch talking about it on the podcast. And it's kind of like we adjusted to the point to where all the guys we were drafting in round 2 are now being taken in round 3 through 5. Yeah. So I'm not sure that avoiding running backs in that range is the same great advice that it used to be. Graham, this has been fantastic. I thank you so much for joining us. I want to give you one more chance. Tell everybody what's going on at Fantasy Points, how they can be a part of it.
Sure. Yeah. As mentioned throughout the show, data.fantasypoints.com. That's, going to be your new home for NFL research for a very long time. We've got some of the coolest splits, tools, filters, like literally any fantasy stat that you could think of. We have any efficiency stat, all of the efficiency stats we were talking about today for running backs, all of them, missed tackles for us, yards after contact, explosive runs. We have all of it. And it's only $50 for this year. We're giving this out because Scott Barrett's a man of the people. Brett Whitefield's a man of the people. I'm a man of the people. We want people to get in there and enjoy advanced analytics and some really cool tools. So make sure you check it out. Training camp's right around the corner, guys. I am so excited. Football's on the doorstep. I'm really excited for this season.
Graham, thank you. Dan, thank you to everybody who listened to the first official episode of Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. Thank you, and we will talk to you next Tuesday.